Hello, everybody. I hope you are all hearing and seeing me now. This is the first time I've ever run a webinar. And so I am trusting that, that things are going well already. That was, when you were waiting, that was a work of music that I suspect you've never heard before, because it was written by a composer who is more or less now completely obscure. But he happens to be Martial Caillebotte, the brother of Gustave Caillebotte, about whom we had an exhibition here at the Kimball just 4 years ago. I am George Shackelford, the Deputy Director of the Kimball, and it's my very great pleasure to take you on a tour through a part of Paris that is particularly dear to me, the 6th arrondissement, the 6th district of Paris, at the heart of Paris's left bank. So before we begin our tour, I'm gonna share my screen again, and we'll go on the road with, excuse me, having a hell of a time, pardon my language, getting this to function. Now there we go. On the road with the Kimball. A few technical issues that I want you to call your attention to. If today you want to ask a question, use the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your Zoom window, and it will bring a pane up at the right that you can type a question into and send it to me. I won't see it during the presentation, but at the end, when I'm not looking at the full-scale screen, I'll be able to look at them and will respond to your questions as much as possible. Your microphone is muted during the program, so you won't be able to ask a question except in writing. This is the first of a series of programs that we're doing over the course of the next year or so, titled On the Road with the Kimball. And they connect in some ways to travel programs that the Kimball has already had. And in this case, it connects to a trip to Paris that we were to have made a few years ago, but had to be canceled. So Secret Paris was the title of that trip, and this is one segment of that concept. Most of you are, I suspect, familiar with Paris. Many of you may have been there. You may, even if you haven't been there, you may know some of its monuments by reputation or by heart. And just to refamiliarize you with the layout of Paris, here's a map showing the blue River Seine curving around and through the city. The bright yellow part is the outline of the city itself, surrounded by parks on most sides, and this is a map from the 19th century. It features the Eiffel Tower, the Arc de Triomphe, the Louvre, just to the right of the image, Notre Dame, just below the image, and the Bastille, just to the left of the image. Today, we're going to concentrate on this segment of Paris, the 6th arrondissement, which is therefore located right there in the center of the left bank. That's the part of the Paris that is south of the river, so-called the left bank, because if you were rowing downriver, it would be on your left. And here is a map of just that arrondissement. Our rendezvous place is where the red star is at the top of the slide, and that is the Institute of France, the Institut de France, which was originally called the College of Four Nations, the Collège des Quatre Nations, which was conceived by Cardinal Mazarin in the 1650s, and the building was commissioned by his successor, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, from the architect Louis Le Vau, one of the architects of the great Chateau of Versailles for Louis XIV, and who was at work at the moment that this commission was given to him on the south facade of the Louvre, immediately facing the Institute. So we are standing here with our backs to the Louvre and looking over the Pont des Arts, which is a Napoleonic era bridge, which was made out of iron. Since this photograph was taken, it has been modified and the number of arches reduced so that the pillars would be farther apart, so that bigger boats than the small ferry boat you're seeing there could make it under the bridge. Here it is in the 1860s, being painted by Renoir, painting now at the Norton Simon Museum. And here's another view of the embracing arms of the Institute, taken from within the plaza just in front of it. At the far right, a little bit off screen, there is a portal in one of the wings, which, if we went through it, would put us out there. You see the little green view through the portal at the center right of this image, which would put us out behind the Institut and on the Rue de Seine. And here we are going to descend the Rue de Seine, but not very far, because we will have met early in the morning and we need to have some coffee. So we're going to stop at La Palette, a cafe named for the palette, the painter's palette, that is so ubiquitous in this area and was so very much a factor in the life of the 6th arrondissement, which has always been one of the centers for artistic life. It's a very charming old cafe from the late 19th century, early 20th century. I warn you, however, never try to go to the bathroom there. After we finished our coffee, we're going to move out from the Rue de Seine onto the Rue Jacob, and then we're going to turn at the Rue de Fürstenberg, which you see at the left here. It's no car entry, but we're going to walk down and end up in the Place Fürstenberg, which is a beautiful little square, kind of hidden away and often bypassed by people who don't know it's there, since no big road leads to it. A little road leads in and a little road leads out. And turning to the right in this image, we're going to walk through an archway beneath the buildings and end up at the front door of the National Museum of Eugène Delacroix, the Musée Delacroix, as it's generally known. Now, Eugène Delacroix is going to feature very large in my guided tour today, because I'm going to take you to see three major sites at which Delacroix worked in the later years of his career. Here is Delacroix as a youngish man, mature but still young, and at a relatively advanced age in the 1850s, which you see him at the right in a cabinet card made by Nadar. And this is his most famous work, because this image has been co-opted by the musical Les Mis. It has become more famous than it was even in the 19th century. But it was a sensation when it was first exhibited at the Salon of 1830 in the environment of revolution that was happening in that year. Years after he had finished the Liberty Leading the People, which I showed you a moment ago at the Louvre, he moved into a new studio. And this is a studio that he occupied in the 1850s and up until his death in 1863. He moved here in 1857, stayed there till 1863. And while he was working here, while he was living here, he was continuing work on a project that we're going to see in a few minutes' time. In the 1920s, this building was threatened with being demolished. And a group of admirers of Delacroix managed to purchase the building to save it for the nation and eventually to give it to the nation so that it could become the Delacroix Museum. And looking through this window, we would see the interior of his studio on the second level, looking out onto the very beautiful private garden that belonged to him. And now the studio is set up as a museum with examples of his work from various periods of his life, many of them on deposit from the Louvre, which has the biggest collection of his paintings and drawings in the world. He worked here, and in this display, you see a version of his famous Women of Algiers, a portrait, a sketch for a ceiling decoration at the right, and on the easel, a painting which I want to call to your attention, which is a relatively speaking recent acquisition of the museum. And I wanted very, very much to buy this painting for the Museum of Fine Arts Boston when I was a curator there. It's a series of studies of different motifs, two Bibles that have been covered with jewels and pictorial imagery, a little vignette from etching by Goya at the lower right-hand corner, and then at the lower left-hand corner for Goya, and at the lower right-hand corner, the hem of a coat of Greek design with its extraordinary bright gold ornament, which Delacroix has suggested by rubbing his brush and the butt of his brush through the thick, wet paint. When Delacroix died in 1863, he was maybe the most famous, most admired artist in France, and above all, admired by a younger generation. And a younger generation of artists who were on the move and who were looking on the foundation set by Delacroix to change French art. Among the people represented in this homage to Delacroix, painted in 1864, are the novelist and critic Duranty at the far left, the painter of the picture himself, Henri Fontaine-Latour, in his shirt sleeves. Standing very elegantly in a long black coat is James McNeill Whistler. Then we see behind the imaginary portrait of Delacroix, which Fontaine-Latour painted based on a photograph. In front of the painting, seated, is Champfleury, an important critic, the painter Manet, and then finally at the far right, the poet and critic Charles Baudelaire. These artists and writers who come out of the period of Romanticism and who begin and are embarking on a new period of painting modern life were very much beholden to Delacroix. And like I said, he was at that point one of the most famous artists in the world. Leaving the Place Fauconberg, and we're going to run around the corner slightly and go down the Rue de Seine and the Rue de Tournon, as it becomes, towards the Palace of Luxembourg, as they say in France. And here is the splendid north facade of this palace, which was erected in the 1600s, but begun about 1615 for Marie de Medici. Now, Maria de Medici, or as she's known in France, Marie de Médicis, was the wife of the great French king, Henry IV, a king who was enormously influential in the building of Paris and in its urban programs in the 17th century. She was a woman of enormous wealth when she came to France, and she became an incredibly powerful queen, in part because her husband died and she was left in widowhood. There you see her at right, wrapped in black, sitting on a throne. She was left in widowhood as the regent of her minor son, who became Louis XIII. Now, this painting by Rubens is part of a great cycle that he painted for her, the Marie de Medici cycle, it's often called, which is now in the Louvre, but which was painted for this palace. And it is certainly one of the grandest cycles of decorative painting ever to be made, and one of Rubens's masterpieces. But in at the period of the Revolution, and around the time of the end of the Revolution, the Luxembourg Palace was changed over from being a royal palace into a public building, which you see it is now. Notice all the red, white, and blue, or blue, white, and red, as they say, flags of the French state that are displayed all around the building. It became, in fact, the Senate of France. And here is the slightly later 19th century, very, very grand auditorium of the Senate, the council hall, if you will, the place where the senators sit and hear arguments and vote on laws, surrounded by great gilded decorations and obviously a very opulent setting for their commentary and their deliberations. This astonishing room was commanded by Napoleon III, the Emperor of France, who took over in the 1840s, and then in 1851, in a coup, declared himself the Emperor of France. And there was no one who liked fancy stuff and gilding any more than Napoleon III did. It's a remarkable interior based on the famous Gallery of Apollo, which was part of the Renaissance decorations of the Louvre, and in which Delacroix was eventually to paint the dominant ceiling painting of the Chariot of Apollo, but that came later. First, he was asked by the people who were doing over the palace as a legislative zone to paint the cupola in the library of the Senate. And here in a much more modest room with extremely beautifully crafted mahogany bookcases along a classical model, and preserving an older ceiling above the reading room for the library. But in a cupola, which is slightly out of the way, he painted a story based on Dante's Divine Comedy. And as if the cupola was open to the sky and people were walking around a porthole into the room below to, in a way, comment on and judge the actions of the Senate. In a little arched, here's a segment of the cupola where you see in red and purple Dante and Virgil meeting the poets of the ancient past. And here a triumph of the French state based on ancient prototypes. Leaving the building, we're going to walk into the gardens of the Palace of Luxembourg, which are open to the public all the time. The palace itself is not that easy to visit, and there are only certain parts of it that are open. It really is a functioning building for the Senate and the senators, and as you can imagine, it's a pretty high security place. On 2 times a year, it's open to the public in what the French call the days of patrimony, the Journée de Patrimoine, which are several days in September and June, which if you happen to be in Paris at that time, or when all our pandemics are over, if you can schedule yourself to be in Paris at that time, you can enter a remarkable number of buildings that are ordinarily closed to the public, including the Institut de France, the Palais de Luxembourg, and many embassies, which used to be palaces of the French nobility. But we're going to walk through this garden as everyone has done since it opened to the public. Here's John Singer Sargent painting some Parisians walking in the glow of the moon and the late sun in the garden of the Palace of Luxembourg. And we're going to enter a little wooded area where we're going to encounter the Fountain of Delacroix. Now, this is a monument that was built some 30 years after Delacroix had died, but when he was still being revered as one of the great artists of France. And it was erected here because this was the most public place that and the nearest to some of his greatest works of art that people could think of. The sculpture was designed and modeled by Jules Dalou, D-A-L-O-U, who was one of the most important followers and sometimes competitors of Rodin at the period. And here is Dalou in his atelier, in his workrooms, with other monuments that you can see in halfway finished form behind him. And again, using photographs, he was able to make an extremely compelling likeness of the painter. And it's surrounded by these groves of evergreen trees and a very beautiful little discovery to come upon as you're walking through the Luxembourg Gardens. The first time I saw it, I did not know that I was going to encounter it. And it really is one of those things that happens a lot in Paris, where you're just wandering or on your way from one thing to another, and suddenly something catches your eye and you don't really understand what it is right away, but you go back and look it up. In my days, in a book, in a guidebook that I had for Paris, or nowadays, you can pull out your phone and Google it on the spot to find out where you are and what it is that you're looking at. Leaving the gardens of the Luxembourg, we're going to make our way up towards Saint-Sulpice, the Place Saint-Sulpice, where there is an extraordinary church, the Church of Saint-Sulpice, which was begun in the Baroque period, basically, it was very much conceived, here it is in the later 19th century in a painting by Raffaelli, but very much conceived in a very Baroque style with these great swooping buttresses, topped by towers at the corners, and these bulbous, very, very Baroque, French Baroque forms. It is largely, however, a creation of the mid to late 18th century. And at a certain point, there was a fire and a lightning strike, and the towers that the architect Servandoni, the Italian architect who was working in Paris at the end of the Baroque period, the beginning of the Rococo period, his initial tower designs had to be replaced. And oddly enough, they were replaced by a pair of mismatched towers that have always been mismatched. I do not know how they managed to build them without making a pair, but it was clearly someone's intention to do so. And they sit on either end of this really beautiful colonnade in a very classicizing style that, that was adapted from Servandoni's original facade. The church is the second biggest church in Paris. And here we are standing in the west end of the church, looking towards the altar at the east end. And on either side, opening out, are the crossings, the transepts of the church. And you can see how there are these giant order Corinthian pilasters that give this church an extremely classical and monumental quality. Everything about it is not very unlike the plan of a Gothic church. A long nave going from east to west, and a crossing, the transept, going from north to south, forming the shape of a cross, and with a kind of ambulatory around the high altar, entered here on either side by these arched openings that you see directly in front of you, and with a succession of chapels to the left and right in every direction, and arcing around the back of the church, below the great rising center portion where the ceiling is as high as in a Gothic church, with windows surrounding and illuminating the interior of the church. It is a place of many, many beautiful works of art, and a few of them are sculptural. These include two images, for instance, of the Virgin Mary, at the left by Pigalle, and at the right by Edmé Bouchardon, Jean-Baptiste Pigalle at the left and Edmé Bouchardon at the right. And the Bouchardon statue is one of a large group. As I return to this slide, you can see her on the pillar at the center right of this image, the Virgin of sadness, and she matches the Christ carrying the cross on the other side of the altar. And these statues were recently restored by the Louvre for an exhibition about Bouchardon that was held in Paris at the Louvre, and then at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. And so they have been brought up to this beautiful state of cleanliness, more clean looking perhaps because they are standing against some very dirty stone walls. So the contrast of their whiteness and the darkness or the griminess perhaps of the gray stone is more pronounced than it perhaps ought to be. We're going to talk about restoration a lot during this the part of the talk, and you're going to see how things are in need of or have just been restored. Some of my favorite objects in the whole church are these holy water. This is two views of the holy water fonts, of which there are two. And so holy water will sit down in these giant clamshells, which there are a pair of them, and they were a gift from the Republic of Venice to the Renaissance king of France, Francis I. It's Francis I who brought Leonardo da Vinci, for instance, to Paris, or to his court, and where he died at Amboise, the king's chateau. At some time in the 18th century, these royal possessions were transferred to the Church of Saint-Sulpice, and they were mounted on carvings made by Pigalle that suggested nautical or aquatic, shall I say, themes. And in this one, you can see it particularly well on the right. There is an upside down octopus with all its marvelous tentacles with their double row of suction cups. And this octopus, a small octopus, needless to say, is underneath as if he's going to suddenly reach up and grab onto the clamshell. Down around the bottom of the sculpture are some sort of coral growths in darker gray marble. But this whole thing is just such a delightful Rococo conception that, and when you encounter the pair of them, again, it's something that you don't immediately know what it is, but you recognize that it is remarkable and something different. The author of one of my favorite works of art in the Church of Saint-Sulpice is the artist Michel-Ange Slotz, about whom I dare you to say you have actually heard. He's an artist that is all really, really very little known, but a very talented sculptor and a great sort of conceiver of a sculptural composition, because not only are the figures here supremely well modeled, and look at the bronze skeleton. He's cast in bronze to be able to achieve the thinness of the bony arms and fingers, not to mention the scythe, but placed against carved black marble, and then the white marble for the portrait of a man named Jean-Baptiste Longuet de Gergy, who was the head priest of the Church of Saint-Sulpice until his death in 1748. Now, those of you who are fans of Dan Brown and the novel The Da Vinci Code will remember that much of it is set in this church. Much of the drama is set in or is centered on, shall I say, this church, in which Dan Brown made up a new significance for an element in the church, which is a line that's inscribed in the floor of the church, which Gergy was the priest that commissioned this from an English astronomer and the astronomical architect, shall we say. The astronomer came in, figured out where he could make slits in the wall of the church to let light come through. And as the shadow, it became a giant sundial. The interior of the church itself became a giant sundial, and you could see the rays of light falling on a line inscribed in the floor. And where they were on this line, it was like a sundial, and the priest could discover the actual moment of the solstice, which would allow him to figure out the best days for the celebration of Easter, for instance. But Slotz was a fantastic carver, and the way he has used sort of the different colors of the marbles against each other is, I think, really genius in this monument. Again, one of those things which, while it's not actually hidden, is often overlooked. The Church of Saint-Sulpice is remarkable also in that it has a very serious congregation. It is one of the real centers of worship in Paris for the devout Catholics. And here I think we are encountering a day of perhaps ordination. But you see, even though they're all wearing masks, this is a relatively recent photograph, they're seated in the nave in pretty large numbers. And this is also a fantastic ad from the Facebook website of the Church of Saint-Sulpice, and I just love it. It's called Les Afters, after, and they don't pronounce it as if it were Frenchified. They pronounce it after. because it was inspired by the notion of an after party, the kind of party that you would have when all of the nightclubs had closed down. But the afters for this very devout group of young professional Roman Catholics has now moved up to the hour of 7 o'clock. And of course, that was to get everybody home before the 9 o'clock curfew. And now they've been, in the last 3 or 4 days, they've been told they have to stay home all the time. So the beer, praise, and speech that was occurring in the crypt of Saint-Sulpice for young professionals is going to be put on hold for quite a while. And the afters will resume at some point in the future, we hope. We're going to get to Delacroix in this magnificent church. And here is a view, the kind of view you might have if you were just sort of rounding the corner. And next to the southern door in the west facade, which you see there with the man coming through it at the lower right-hand corner, next to this door is an extremely beautiful chapel, commissioned by the church from Delacroix in the early 1750s. And he began work on it in 1855. And just 2 years before he moved to the nearby studio, and kept work on it until 1861, 2 years before his death. Here it is nowadays. Here it was just a few years ago, with the painting completely covered in grime and all of the surrounding and framing works covered in grime. And here we have some people who are photographing, I believe, the before restoration condition of the chapel. It has a very large and very illuminating window on the south wall. And now that the paintings have been cleaned, their extraordinary color is revealed. So here's what we would see if we were facing that window. To our left would be a scene from the Old Testament of Jacob wrestling the angel. And on the right, the depiction of Heliodorus driven from the temple by a Christian saint. And then finally on the ceiling above is Saint Michael vanquishing the demon. Now you see then at either side of this image, the bright color of the treetops at the left and the bright color of the flying drapery in the temple view at the right. I'm gonna have us turn around and with our back to the window, look up at how this whole thing works as a composition. This is what you would see if you looked up as you were entering the chapel. Now we're as if we were leaving the chapel, and we now see Heliodorus on the right, on the left, and Jacob and the angel on the right. The paintings were made in a medium that had been adopted by a couple of artists for the decoration of churches in the years before Delacroix started painting this. And it is encaustic, which is a wax-based medium that allowed the paint to withstand the variations in temperature and humidity that would naturally occur in a big, underheated, drafty, not air-conditioned church. And the waxy paint, as opposed to linseed oil as a binder, for instance, stood up to all of these shifts better than anything else. It also created an extraordinary texture. And I think in this photograph, you can see how very textural the surface of the painting is. Look at the way the brushwork is achieved on the arm, how we are seeing even the reflections of the window light onto textured passages at the upper left and the upper right, and this extraordinary vivid very, very brilliantly painted surface is just a truly extraordinary thing. Here's a detail of the Jacob wrestling the angel. And perhaps my favorite detail in the whole chapel is this beautiful still life of Jacob's hat, his cloak, his spear, his gourd bottle, his quiver. He has laid all these implements down while he is wrestling with the angel. And as I looked at this one time, I started thinking, you know, this looks really a lot like another painter, and that is Vincent van Gogh. Now, Delacroix was not only a hero to artists like Whistler, Fontaine, and Manet, he stayed on being a hero to artists like Van Gogh and Gauguin. Van Gogh copies frequently images by Delacroix. Gauguin, when in the South Seas, is writing all of the time about Delacroix and copying things out of Delacroix's journals, which had been published in the 1890s. And Vincent van Gogh, I know, was in this church before he painted, in the very end of his life, the woman sitting in the wheat field, painted at Auvers in the last months of his life in 1890. And I think you can see very easily how, in terms of palette, in terms even of the hatching brushstrokes that Van Gogh uses to suggest the shading of the woman's dress, and the same texture that Delacroix is building up in wax, Vincent is able to achieve in oil paints. And so this is to remind you that Delacroix was, for many, many years after his death, very much revered, and certainly an incredibly important artist for an artist like Matisse and Picasso in the 20th century, both of whom made copies of works by Delacroix. Looking back in the chapel, we have this extraordinary view, again, of the two sides. And if we turned around from the previous position, we would see the great organ loft of this church. And here is the fantastic organ that was built in 1862 by someone who is very famous to people who love organs, a man named Aristide Cavaillé-Coll. And it is a renowned, very, very famous organ. It had, and for those of you who know anything about organ playing, I'm going to get technical for a moment. It featured 102 speaking stops on 5 manuals and pedal, and it is perhaps the most impressive instrument of the French 19th century and the Romantic era. Now, because of the great organ in the church, it's always had great organists since the 19th century. And since 1985, here's the casing, which was designed to look like it had been done in the 18th century, but was in fact done in the 19th century. And since 1985, this man, whose name is Daniel Roth, has been the organist of Saint-Sulpice. And I'm going to play us a little bit of his play of a piece by the composer Vierne. And if I can get it to run, I'm going to do it just now. I think you can hear the extraordinary sophistication that the organ brings. And as a background to the singing, which is just beginning now, this is a Kyrie from a mass by Vienne. So we'll leave the church, and you can, in fact, go to the church and sit at the back during a service of worship and hear the liturgical music on any Sunday morning when when people are worshiping in the church. There's an extraordinarily beautiful square in front of the Church of Saint-Sulpice, and the street that is exiting the square just to the left, just to the right of this fountain, where you see the very bright wall and a balcony on the next to the last floor. That street is the street I lived on when I moved to Paris in 1980 for a period of 2 years living there, which really is the origin of my deepest familiarity and love for the city when I was working on my doctoral dissertation. I had a fellowship that allowed me to stay in Paris for that time, and that's when I came to know all of these places in that period in some 40 years ago. But it still seems like it just happened, like yesterday, and it's still as vivid to me as it was before. We're going to leave the Church of Saint-Sulpice, and we're going to walk up to the square of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. You see, what we've done is we've made a kind of horseshoe from the church, from the Institut de France. We've gone down to the Place Fauconberg and the Delacroix Museum, down the Rue de Tournon to the Palace of Luxembourg, out of the Luxembourg into its garden to see Delacroix's monument, then up to Saint-Sulpice, and now we're heading up to the Church of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. Saint-Germain-des-Prés is here on the Boulevard Saint-Germain and is a remarkable church. But first, we need to stop and have something to eat. And we can go to the Café of Deux Magots, which many of you may have been to if you've been to Paris. It has become one of the key stops on any American tourist's itinerary. It was founded at this spot in 1873 as a lingerie store, believe it or not. And the Deux Magots are Mandarin magicians. They sit inside. They're two fantastic statues carved in wood of Chinese. They look like Chinese emperors, but in fact they are magicians, wise men, if you will. And the church was, the cafe was absolutely one of the great centers of intellectual life in the 20th century, with people like Hemingway or James Joyce often hanging out here, Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre, and again, Americans, not only Hemingway, but the African-American author James Baldwin and the famous Julia Child were frequenters of this cafe throughout the 1950s and 60s. And you can still go there nowadays. If you would prefer to go someplace else down the street, there's the Café de Flore, and then to the right of the Deux Magots is the Bonaparte. All of them serve good food and drink. And they will enable us to be strong enough to turn back to going into the Church of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. Saint-Germain-des-Prés is the oldest church in Paris, though the oldest part of the church is the tower that you see here, which has been modified over the years. The original church was built around in the year about 540, 555. So really half a millennium into the period of post-Christian era. And it was built as it was originally named the Abbey of Sainte-Croix Saint-Vincent, the Holy Cross St. Vincent. But by the middle of the 18th century, it had been renamed for Saint Germanus, who had been appointed bishop of Paris by the founder of the abbey, who was the king, Childebert, who was a Merovingian king of France. And Saint-Germain, as he's called, was later canonized. Now, the area on which it was built was kind of a floodplain in the 540s. And until much later, no one was really able to build on this area. So the church stood, and its abbey, and the farmland around it stood in the middle of fields, and a field in French is a pré. So it's called Saint-Germain-des-Prés, the Church of Saint Germanus in the fields, and is distinguished from another church of Saint-Germain, which is up by the Louvre, which is called Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois. Like I said, the oldest part that survives is the tower, and the interior has been rebuilt and restored and modified over the years. And in the 19th century, in the 1840s, this artist, whose name is Hippolyte, or Hippolyte, to pronounce it in an American way, Hippolyte Flandrin, was called upon to decorate the interior of the church. He's maybe best known for this painting, which you have seen in the Louvre, and which is featured on many posters and such, the young man sleeping beside the sea. And it's a testament to his great prowess at anatomy and drawing and painting mixed all together. And we'll know a little bit more about that when we talk about the École des Beaux-Arts in just a few minutes. Here's his portrait of Napoleon III. Here is a double portrait of two brothers that he painted, which is now at the Cleveland Museum of Art. Here is an earlier drawing of himself in profile with his brother, Paul Flandrin, who was mostly a landscape painter. And Hippolyte was then photographed by Gustave Le Gray in the center, a much deteriorated daguerreotype, and then drawn in the 1850s by Ingres. Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, who was one of the most powerful painters in France in the first half of the 19th century, the sometime director of the French Academy in Rome, and the great rival of Delacroix, but very much more conservative than Delacroix, but one of the greatest draftsmen who ever lived. And this portrait of the aging Hippolyte Flandrin is a fantastic image by him. So the church was given over to Flandrin to decorate the interior. And though he certainly had assistance for some of the purely decorative patterning of the church, he was responsible himself for the pictorial parts that you see, the saints standing in between columns, or the image of Christ in majesty standing at the center of the arch at the center of this slide. Now, this is the state of this church as it was about 12 years ago. And Flandrin had been called in. He created a completely 19th century vision of what a Gothic church would have looked like in the Middle Ages. Because, of course, most of these churches were highly decorated on their interior. And over the years, all of that pigment fell off and then was eventually cleaned off, so that the churches that we admire for their beautiful stone that stone would have been covered over when the churches were first finished. And so Flandrin went in and reconceived with his 19th century imagination what a great Gothic church interior should have looked like. And so every surface of the church was covered over with paintings. And many of them, like this one, were wide and broad. This panel must be 15 feet wide or more. And it was in really deplorable condition. You can see where it's been scratched, abraded, where portions like the horses and the riders at the right-hand side have been damaged by water, and they've kind of, the encaustic has kind of bloomed in that area. These two are these are the first paintings, I think, made in encaustic for church decoration in the 1840s, when he was called to do this decoration. It lasted over many years, of course, to achieve it all. But they were painting in encaustic. And as I said, about 12 years ago, there was a campaign begun to restore this interior. And look at the lower left-hand corner of this slide, and you'll see here and here and here, you will see squares that have been cleaned, opening a little window through the grime down to what the original surface is, or what the best parts of the remaining original surface are. And over the course of a little more than a decade, this church has been and is still being progressively restored. This is a before image where some parts of the paint of the church have been already cleaned. You can see that up at the upper left, there's a panel that is looking in pretty good shape. But in other parts, the paint is still very dull. And for instance, look at the dull paint over the arch at the right as compared to the paint over the arch at the left. And here is the apse with the various chapels that make the circuit around the curved walls and pillars and arches of the apse. And here it is before being cleaned. This is also before, but a little brighter day. Look at the big patches of lost paint and plaster and encaustic at the top on the ceiling and under the arches, big white patches where everything is gone, basically. And this is a before. You see the white areas following the stonework in the lower segment of the lowest triangle at the left, and white lines going through, which are, again, where the pigment has been lost. And here's the same thing cleaned and restored. This picture just taken by a friend of mine in Paris just a few days ago by accident. She didn't know I was going to be using it, and she's posted it on Facebook, and I stole it for this presentation. And here's that apse, the ceiling of the apse as it's now restored. And I wish I could hear you all gasping for breath because you sort of need your sunglasses now to appreciate the pictorial and coloristic quality of this amazing church. So we go from before to after, and here you see the rich and complex decorative patterning that Flandrin devised for the arches, the sort of groin arches of the church, the boss, the circular disc with acanthus leaves that stands at the juncture of all the red lines coming together. The stars on the field of blue, which were one of the most beautiful aspects of the church. If you wanted to, for instance, and you may still be able to go to the church's website and sponsor a star if you'd like, and give them some money for their restoration. Again, the beautiful patternings, the coloristic sophistication of all of this, the sense that no surface deserved to be plain. Really, it's only the occasional red or dark blue element that remains unpatterned. And all of this working very beautifully with the windows, which of course, when the walls were all dirty, they seemed almost too bright. And now you can see how the harmony of the stained glass works directly with the concept of the wall paintings. Here's another after image. There's a before and after. I mean, just extraordinary what they've been able to do. And here we are now looking down the church from the apse. We're looking down. We see the light coming in from brighter windows on the north side of the church. And these details also taken by my friend Sabrina, which could give you a beautiful sense of how finessed the colors and patterns are. And there we are with that whole nave shining brightly. So Hippolyte Flandrin was one of the great products of the École des Beaux-Arts, which is our next to the last stop. But before we get there, I forgot we need to spend a moment at Ladurée. Now, those of you who like macarons will remember that Ladurée has become the most famous candy and cookie store in Paris. And it didn't have a branch on the left bank until just a few years ago, when on the corner of the Rue Bonaparte, which is moving off to the left, and the Rue Jacob, which is moving off to the right, in this building, they took over the ground and mezzanine floors and created a candy store, basically. Now, when I moved to Paris back in the 1980s, this was still the premises of Madeleine Castaing. And there's Madame Castaing with her husband. This photograph must be taken just after the war. And here is that same street corner, which was her showroom and her offices. She was an extraordinary interior decorator who became really famous, perhaps even more famous after her death. But she was an extraordinary public figure in France in the 20th century. She and her husband were great patrons of the Jewish painter in Paris in the pre-war years, Chaim Soutine, and there her portrait painted in a red dress and a fur coat by Soutine. Here she is in the center, looking a bit like Coco Chanel, in a dress that she must have had her upholsterer work up to match the upholstery on a sofa that she's leaning on. So she coordinates her outfit to match her decor. And then on the right, there she is in old age, absolutely indomitable. And you can tell that she must have been an extraordinary conversationalist from the look in her eye and her determination not to grow old. Madame Castaing is famous for a number of cosmetic strategies that she used to keep herself looking young, at least in her own imagination. One of them, and I don't see it here, one of them was to string an elastic over her head, under her chin. Those of you who are getting any older can realize that you could really use a little bit of a boost under the chin to hold up your double chin, hold up her double chin. And over that elastic, she would then place a wig, and she always wore a wig, never was seen with her own hair. I also think you can see that she's, first of all, she's got this great suit on, but, excuse me, she's decided to hide the fact that her hands have aged by putting on a very dashing pair of kid gloves, red kid gloves. And she's seated, I do beg your pardon, she's seated in what I think is one of the salons in her country house, not far from Paris. Forgive me for a moment, I'm gonna have to take a sip of coffee. Now, make sure that I'm being heard again. The ground floor of her building looked like this when I lived in Paris in the 1980s. And it was this fantastic mix of things that were kind of shabby. It was before the invention of the term shabby chic, but she certainly understood it. And look, for instance, at the sofa, the gold colored sofa in the picture. My apologies. In the picture on the left, where the upholstery is basically rotting and falling apart. There are some samples of her own designs for fabric in those, excuse me, in those stripes that are gathered around the sort of gathered or draped back of the sofa. And on the right is the kind of furniture that she made very, very fashionable amongst a rather sophisticated group of clients who wanted to furnish their homes with things that looked as if they had always been there. So old-fashioned opaline lamps, or that had been converted from oil to electricity, strange sort of lounge chairs upholstered in bright green velvet, a plaster bust of some friend in one place or another, and again, the upholstery, which seems to be very idiosyncratic, which is both floral and striped at the same time. On the floor above was her apartment, and it has unfortunately been dismantled now, but happily good photographs of it remain. And in this one, which I think is particularly fine, we see her fondness for blue, with these bright blue window curtains in one room, gold in another, mixed with blue. And you move down, and the blue carpet and the blue upholstery on the neoclassical chair must be the inspiration for the decor of that mezzanine floor at Ladurée, where you can go in and take tea and cookies in the afternoon. And we will need another break on our way up to the École des Beaux-Arts. Well, let's go there. And this is almost the last stop on our trip. The École des Beaux-Arts goes back, like the College of France, to the 17th century, around the time of around the time of the founding of the Collège des Quatre Nations, the École des Beaux-Arts, which is to say the School of Fine Arts. And it was the School of Fine Arts and Architecture until many years later. The school was created in order to provide a training course for the great architects and artists who were going to continue the French traditions as established by the court of Louis XIV. The official artists who were going to be called to serve the court and paint pictures for churches and do decorations for the nobility as well. At the École, when you entered, you could compete for the biggest prize there was, a fellowship to go to Rome, and it was called the Rome Prize, or the Prix de Rome. And the competitions for this would go on for a long period of time, and you would be allowed a certain amount of time to come up with a painting idea, to execute it, to show them the first sketch, to do the completion of the thing, and the best picture won. I almost said the best man won, and in fact, it was exclusively open to men until 1897, when the École des Beaux-Arts was opened to women. Now, women at the time could get instruction in private from private teachers. The painter Berthe Morisot, for instance, was taught by the painter Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot, and she received her Morisot studying under Corot was considered genteel, and she couldn't have gotten into the academy at any rate, nor of course be sent to Rome at that period. The buildings that you see here, largely to left and right, were the conception of an architect called Félix Duban, D-U-B-A-N, who was hired to sort of regularize the bunch of buildings on the site, and in the 1830s was given charge of making the École des Beaux-Arts into a more logical place to be. It was interesting, though, that in the early days there was, for instance, a screen across the back end of the courtyard, and here it is from the other side. Undoubtedly one of the sort of monuments that was meant to inspire the architects who were working on the site. To the far right, as you enter the courtyard, is this facade which has been moved from the Chateau d'Annet, a great Renaissance chateau, and put in place here in a modified form to serve also as the entry to a remarkable chapel, as it's called, never had a religious function, but set up to be like a chapel, in which are displayed works of the Renaissance and Baroque and medieval periods. So along the walls are tombs. All of this is done in plaster, and it's reproductions that were put in place for students to work from. So you see a variety of Italian Renaissance masters around this tomb. At the right in the background, you see some of the gates from the baptistry in Florence from the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance. And here, I think too, that some of this is going under restoration. You see here workers in that room in modern times. As we walk back into the courtyard and go through the red doors flanked by copies of ancient Roman and Greek statues, we enter one of the most remarkable spaces in the building, in the complex, which is this two-story glazed, what was created as a study area for classical architecture and sculpture. So imagine in the 19th century and the early 20th century, this room filled with elements of ancient art. So a corner in plaster, mind you, from the Parthenon piece of the great Roman bronzes that are set up at on St. Mark's Square in Venice. And here we see artists drawing from those elements in a 19th century wood engraving. The core, however, of the instruction at the Academy for painters, above all, was drawing from the live model. And here we see at the end of the 19th century, the body of the male students who were gathered around this long-suffering female model, who nonetheless manages to eke out a smile. They must have been playing a great game of posing all together. But many of the models were also men. And it was an absolutely standardized practice, because here are two drawings by two different artists of the same pose down to the crossing of the ankles, adopted by two different models at two different drawing sessions. The one on the right is by Degas and is at the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, where on the back of the drawing is seen the same pose seen from the back. But posing like this is at the absolute center of most practice in the late 19th century of any artist who was going to deal with the human figure at all. So here we have drawings by Ingres at the left, by Degas at the center, and by the more academic artist Pierre Puvis de Chavannes at the right, all of which could not be conceived of without the example of drawing at the École des Beaux-Arts. And while the study of the model, of the living figure, was important, if you were an architect, what you were going to do was study from those monuments of the past. And if you were lucky, you got to go to Rome and study from ancient architecture there. Now, the architecture school of the École des Beaux-Arts stayed very active on this site until the sort of revolutions of 1968. And when the architecture school was separated from the Academy of Fine Arts, the Beaux-Arts. And all along that time, architects were being trained in Paris. You had architects like Richard Morris Hunt, the great architect of Biltmore Castle in North Carolina, for instance, learning his trade in Paris at the École des Beaux-Arts. And here's a drawing by, it could be by any of these very accomplished draftsmen of architectural, the style that is in fact referred to as the Beaux-Arts architectural style because of how many people who practiced it had been to the École des Beaux-Arts. And one of the finest and the last in a way in this genre is John Russell Pope, the architect of the National Gallery of Art in Washington. And I think you can easily see how the studies that he might have made in line with the drawing that we just saw by another artist, how all of that prepared him to build in the 20th century, at the end of the Depression, to build this monumental stone building, a great palace of art on the Mall in Washington, D.C. Now, one of the architectural marvels of the École des Beaux-Arts is this room, which, like the Senate debating room, is in the form of a half circle, a hemicycle. And on the back wall here, not just architecture, but a painting is put in place. It was painted by Paul Delaroche, and you might have seen the painting that is at the right at the National Gallery in London. It's the beheading of Lady Jane Grey. And it was one of many Renaissance stories that artists like Delaroche interpreted in the 19th century, in the first half of the 19th century. And this is the central composition of the mural by Paul Delaroche, which was not painted in encaustic, not painted as fresco, but in fact was painted in oil paints directly onto the wall, which made it pretty vulnerable, and it has had to be restored a couple of times over the years. It dates from 1837, so just about in the first decade of the creation of this building, which was begun about 1830. And here seated on this kind of throne of honor are the architect, the sculptor, and the painter of the Parthenon in Athens, which you saw looming in the cast court below. And around are the personifications of the medieval art, the woman in green, for instance, with a medieval church next to her, or Greek art, Roman art, etc. And a woman, a muse kneeling in the foreground who is about to hand out the laurel crowns to the artists who are depicted on either side. This is based on the painting by Ingres, the artist I mentioned to you a moment ago. This was painted for a ceiling at the Louvre in a set of rooms devoted to some of the origins of the Louvre Museum. This is the Apotheosis of Homer. And it's clearly the model for this painting by Delaroche. Here's the full painting in all its glory. It's incredibly wide. You can see by gauging the seats that you see below all of those, you can imagine how big people are. And this hemicycle, which you can see from the projector underneath the figure with the laurel leaves, also serves as a lecture hall. Was decorated with all of these painters and sculptors of the ancient past, including Raphael and Albrecht Dürer, and again, Phidias, or a sculptor from, a great sculptor from the German Renaissance, or a great painter from the Italian Middle Ages, all forming the cast of characters. And we think that the artists were probably chosen by Delaroche, but they represent who was thought of as great in the 1830s. If you were standing looking at that view just a moment ago, you're seeing here what was at your back, a very large painting, again by Ingres, of Romulus, the victory at Akron, and we see Romulus there carrying away the trophies, the dead, the vanquished at the right, lying on the ground. And this gigantic painting, life-size or bigger, forms the wall just opposite the hemicycle. The École is very beautifully decorated with frescoes based on Pompeian or even Italian Renaissance models, ornamented with statues and casts everywhere, and occasionally a great monument. Here in a segment of the building that needs to be restored very badly is the beautiful monument to the painter Henri Regnault, who painted the picture that you see at the left when he was a grand prize winner in Rome in the 1860s. It was sent back to France, eventually got rolled up and shipped to America, where it was acquired in the 1880s by the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And when I first joined the Museum of Fine Arts in the mid-1990s, it was lying on its face in the floor, being relined because it had suffered a tear. It's an enormously big painting. Not a very big tear, but nonetheless a tear that had to be repaired. And my colleague and friend Rona Macbeth in Boston spent more than a year cleaning this painting and basically doing just that. Parts of it had to be cleaned manually with a tiny scalpel to scrape off the varnish because it would not dissolve without dissolving the paint beneath it. A remarkable labor on her part, and the painting is about 10 by 10 feet, so you can imagine it covers a lot of space. The academic tradition, the Beaux-Arts tradition, really goes from the 18th century all the way to the 20th. And just imagine artists like Jacques-Louis David, Ingres again, Degas, Bouguereau, William Adolphe Bouguereau, whose giant Youth of Bacchus was not sold at Sotheby's last year. A huge painting, maybe 20 feet wide. And even up to artists like Bonnard, Pierre Bonnard, whose Rape of Europa treats in modern guise a scene from ancient mythology. Well, we've reached the end of our voyage, and we've found ourselves all the way back up at the banks of the Seine and looking at the south facade of the Louvre. But before we cross the river, I want you to go into Sennelier, which is one of the best art supply stores in Paris. It has been in business since the 19th century. Degas, for instance, bought his paints and pastels from Sennelier in the 1880s. It, as you see at the top, is in charge of selling colors for artists, couleurs pour artistes. And the facade is basically unchanged since that time. The things that are in the windows may be a bit different, but it's fundamentally the same store, and filled to the rafters inside with marvelous things that you can buy. Nowadays, you have acrylic paints and wax pastels that didn't exist in the 19th century, but the range of colors and brushes and canvases and stretchers and easels that you can acquire in this place ought to set you up for the art that you're going to make before you enter into the collection of the Louvre. So I want to tell you that the next stop on the tour of Europe and the Americas and Asia with Kimball, on the road with the Kimball, is a lecture, a presentation on Havana that will be given by Robert McCann, who is the head of donor relations, membership, and special events, and also the head of Kimball Travel. And you will get an email announcing the date of this presentation couple of weeks in advance so you can save the date and put it on your calendar. All of these programs will eventually, after you, the members, have been able to look at them for a while, all of them will be recorded. This has been recorded, and it will be presented free for your friends who aren't members of the museum on our YouTube channel. So you'll be able to get at that through the museum website. And just next week, I'm going to be interviewing my old friend, Colin Bailey, who I first knew in Paris in the 1980s. We met in the fall of 1980 there. And I'll be interviewing Colin on a series that we're calling Kimball Connections, where present staff of the museum engages with former staff of the museum to talk about the history of the collection, what they've done after they left the Kimball, what their trajectory of their life has been. And this Thursday at 5 in the afternoon, Colin and I will be talking about his time at the Kimball in the 1980s and early 1990s. So that is that for the time being. And I'm going to stop sharing. And terribly sorry. There I am, back again. And now I'll be able to look at some of the questions that you've asked and give a few answers. I've talked way over my allotted time, so perhaps I'll just answer just a few of these for you. We will certainly be doing this post-COVID. It's too good to not be able. One of your numbers says she hopes we'll do this post-COVID. It's such an interesting way of reaching you that we don't have. And again, you can come to the museum in a way to hear me talk without having to get out of your pajamas if you want to. And you'll be able to hear me again, re-listen to this if you want to over time. Someone else asks about the word on the restoration of Notre Dame. I don't know, honestly. I know that they have begun to dismantle the melted scaffolding that was at the very center of the building, just beneath the spire that was a 19th century spire, but held beautiful statuary going up its sides. That segment of the building got very, very hot. It was the roof that was really burning, and the attic that was burning, and that it melted and warped all of the scaffolding that was holding up that part of the church. And they were scared that if they took it apart, that the church might collapse further. So they had to do a lot of work to make that happen. And they've begun doing that. The timeline of finishing the restoration in time for the Parisian Olympics, I think, is just not going to happen in 2024. So I think that we'll see a longer duration for the project, and it's been very much interrupted, of course, by COVID and the pandemic. I've been asked to provide a list of the artist names, and I think we'll be able to send that out if my crafty assistant, Catherine, can do it to those of you who are listening here, or maybe post it in conjunction with the YouTube video in some way. We might even be able to go in and slightly annotate the YouTube video. I'll see how we can do that. It would be a very good idea. And I didn't label all the slides, and I could have done that, and that would have been easier, but I was thinking they'd go by pretty fast. To all the people who have said thank you, I say you're absolutely welcome. Fascinating, fascinating. Lord Harrington asks, what's up with Whistler being such a sort of stiff dude in the portrait, the Homage de la Roi? Whistler was a notorious dandy and a poser, and he would sometimes carry around a big staff that he would walk with. Instead of a cane, he would walk with a kind of, 17th century regal looking staff, just walking down the street. He came into a cafe in the early days of his career where Degas was sitting. I think it was the cafe of Nouvelle Athènes, de la Nouvelle Athènes, where they used to hang out, or maybe the Café Gerbois. And Degas, who was a bit of a wag, turned to him and said, "Oh, Whistler, hello, where's your muff?" And because he had come in with such grandeur that he should have been, having a muff on his hand to enhance his grandness. And that is the story of, I think, why Whistler is such a poser. Let's see, I am looking for so many wonderful compliments, and I thank you all for them. And let's see. Penny Hastings asked me whether I had intended to lead an actual tour of Secret Paris. And what happened that it did not take place were the attacks at the Bataclan in 2015. And that created a period of unease that many people decided they didn't want to go just then. So it'll happen again sometime. And this walk around was to have been in a perhaps less rigorous way or vigorous way, was to have been part of that trip. Thank you so much to everyone who was here. And thanks for those of you who asked questions. And I thank you very, very much for being around. Again, remember Havana with Robert McCann at a date still to be determined, and the Kimball Connection, the Kimball Connections with Colin Bailey next Thursday at 5 o'clock. And you'll be getting emails about both of those to send you the links to the actual events. So again, thank you. I'm going to sign off and say goodbye. I appreciate your being with me, and we'll do it again. Cheers. Good night.